My last excellent job up here is to introduce, at this time, Julie Johnstone, member of the NPKUA Board of Directors, and to invite you to the podium. Julie is from the PKU organization of Illinois. Julie?
I am honored and delighted to be introducing our next guest. Her father, Robert Guthrie, is one of the reasons we are all here today. His excellence has continued on through his daughter in her efforts to share medical news with the world. It is with great honor I present to you Patricia Guthrie.
Following dancing ants. I don't know if I can. I can assure you that it's not the activity that my father saw when he went to countless conferences on PKU. But maybe you should start a trend and start doing that. Okay, I'm a journalist, been a newspaper reporter for half my life, which I know most of you are saying, that can't be. You must have started when you were 12 or something. So like any good newspaper reporter, I have to refer to my documents. Okay, there's two things I need to tell you in the interest of full disclosure. One of them, I'm a print person. Therefore, I know not anything about this. I just learned how to scan old photos, going through my dad's stuff. I just learned how to make them into a presentation. But when I got here, the file was corrupted. Something was embedded. And someone had to come to my rescue. John, where are you? In case you have to come to my rescue again. Yes, over there. Okay. It's called The History of Newborn Screening, but I should probably call it A History of Newborn Screening, since it's from a very personal perspective. So I realize there's a misspelled word here, right off the bat, being a print reporter. Because apparently once I made that mistake and tried to correct it, I couldn't because it was embedded in the Petri dish. So anyway, it's a story of passion, perseverance, politics, and lots of postcards. And you'll see why. And this is from Hawaii, of course, from my dad saying, "Wish you were here." I'm at a conference. Okay, this is like the photo we know of newborn screening, taking a blood spot from the heel of a baby. But it started out with a very personal mission on my dad's part. Here is the older half of my siblings. I'm the youngest of 6 children. These are the first 3. Keep in mind my father and my mother, Margaret, who had a lot to do with keeping my father on track. And we did not really have a father at home because he was saving what he was doing. And I don't resent it at all. I just never knew about it. I was 2 weeks old when the whole thing started. But so he was supposed to have 2 kids. He ended up with 6. He's called the father of prevention. I just want you to keep that in mind. Okay. So these are my 2 oldest brothers and my older sister. They realized Johnny, who's the young boy on your right, wasn't developing. They thought he was deaf. They took him to a lot of doctors. They could not figure out. This is what he looked like as a baby. And that's when my father and mother became involved in the plight of the mentally retarded. And they had a dual role in all this. At the same time, my father became the father of prevention for phenylketonuria and other metabolic disorders. They also were leading advocates on behalf of retarded citizens. And you realize I'm speaking in the vernacular of 40 years ago. My father worked at the National Institutes of Health. Then he worked at Sloan Kettering in New York City. He was a cancer researcher at first. He was interested in childhood leukemia. And he had the idea that you should put two agents of chemotherapy together to get the best results, to which a cancer doctor poo-pooed it. And, of course, my dad said, of course, in the end, I was right. But he then came to Buffalo, New York. Both my mother and father were from Minnesota, so the joke was they were looking for a warmer climate, so they came to Buffalo. My father started working at the University of Buffalo in Children's Hospital, and Dr. Warner, that you see here, was the director of children's rehabilitation, was very interested in preventing mental retardation. He gave my father a challenge of, we knew from the scientists, as all science works, you build on the shoulders of those before you. And by the time 1958 rolled around, it had been known what caused phenylketonuria. It had been known how to detect it, but not soon enough. And Dr. Warner and others were working on a low phenylalanine diet. The challenge was how to catch it soon enough to prevent the damage. The same time my father was starting to work on this, he got a phone call from Minneapolis. That's my mother's sister and her daughter. My Aunt Mary Lou said, I think that my daughter was just diagnosed with what Bob's working on. And sure enough, Margaret Dahl, who's named after my mother, was diagnosed with phenylketonuria. They confirmed it with a diaper test. She was one of the children back then. Not many states were actually doing this wet diaper test to catch it. So it was too late for her. And she's pretty profoundly retarded. That coincidence, along with my brother, you could imagine how that would propel a researcher to help prevent this in other children. And the challenge was to make it simple and easy enough, and of course, be able to do it on a large mass screening program. The Association of Retarded Citizens at the time was a very active group, and they happened to choose for their poster children in 1961 these two sisters. The older one has PKU. The younger one was tested at birth and put immediately on the diet. And at the time, these poster kids even went and met President Kennedy. For all the youngsters in the room, the Kennedy family, of course, was one of the biggest advocates to try and help the mentally retarded and to do prevention in the field. As the sister, one of the sisters of the Kennedys, was institutionalized. At the same time, Pearl Buck, the author, had her daughter tested, and it was found out that her mental retardation was caused by PKU. My father, this was how I saw him, pretty much. A lot of people say I look like him, which is pretty ironic because I never saw him. But he was on the phone a lot, and we were just very thankful that cell phones and texting and twittering and all that technology were not around, or I don't think I'd recognize what he looked like. But he was relentless. And just like the people who put this whole organization together in this conference, you have to have a mission, and you have to have passion, and you can't take no for an answer. So his challenge now was to convince other doctors and state legislatures around the country that it should be a public health mandate that every child should be tested. And some of you might not believe this, but a lot of doctors didn't go for that idea. Because you have to remember, this was the 1960s. There were no seatbelt laws. There were no helmet laws. There were no laws to tell doctors or the public at large how to save themselves from themselves. So doctors back then did not want politicians starting to tell them what to do. That was a big challenge on my dad's behalf. He had economics on his side because he could prove that the test cost 50 cents per child. A retarded citizen at the time would cost maybe $150,000 for all the care needed. There was a few states that were integral in getting the testing going. One of the ways they did it was to go into institutions and actually test people that were there that were mentally retarded to try and figure out how many had PKU and what the rate of incidence might be. He also came up with the idea that maybe this simple spot of blood that you took at birth could be used for other metabolic diseases. So I grew up at the dining room table conversation with these words. Every night. Margaret, what do you think about maple syrup urine disease? What do you think? Do you think that we'll find enough kids to justify that we also make that a mandate? What about galactosemia? Could you pass the butter, please? I mean, so we were pretty much, you know how it is. You know, your parents do something, it's probably, they're doing pretty good. But so I was just trying to break the barriers of boys' Little League baseball. That's what I was interested in. So that's pretty much what I was doing at the time. Now, there were 3 states, Oregon, Massachusetts, and New York, that were the forefront of getting their state legislatures to pass a law. And the first one was for PKU. This is a New York Times article from 1964. Of course, Senator Edward Kennedy was one of the leaders in Massachusetts. After this, then my dad, once he tackled the United States, there was interest all around the world to apply this. And doctors, and it would be, in other states, it would be their federal government interested in how to get it going for their countries. So that's when my dad started traveling around the world. And I think Geneva might have been one of the first international conferences on PKU. So we started getting a lot more postcards. Actually, one of those postcards, I have it in my thing here, it says, "Dear Margaret, New Zealand is," it's verbatim, "New Zealand is a beautiful country. Very green, no crime, no homelessness, and there's socialized medicine. Maybe we should move here." Well, he did get his wish, you'll find out. Well, when my dad came back from traveling, my dad took so many slides. We have 5 tubs this big each of just slides taken around the world at all his conferences and all the people that worked with him, spanning about 40 years. If anyone has any idea how we can save those or archive those, I'm all ears. Most of the slides, though, look like this. That's the problem. So we dubbed them white lab coats around the world. And he also had a penchant for taking shots from the airport. I don't know why. Oh, look, there's Ireland down there. It's the Rock of Gibraltar, or whatever, Dad. Now, so we went to New Zealand in 1968. My dad made a contact with a doctor down there who wanted to start newborn screening in New Zealand, Australia. It eventually became the base for the South Pacific. My dad had this grand idea that all 6 children should go with him in 2 VW vans. And we should get on a ship and take the vans to New Zealand. We lived there for 9 months. A couple of us kids went to school there. No one had ever seen VW buses down there. And this is what we looked like. We camped. We then went over to Europe on another ship, and we camped all through Europe. And my father, in his later years, I think he was so proud of the fact that I think we camped 153 days in a row and never stayed in a hotel. He's Scottish, too, so you should know that. I jumped ahead here, but the history of newborn screening in the last decade has been more of a fight of how many kids should benefit, and why do some states screen for 8 disorders and some states screen for 40, and why is it like genetic roulette if my son was born here and wasn't screened, and now he's going to be disabled. If he had been born in the next state over, he would have been caught and treated. So that became a very interesting fight that I covered as a reporter. And it was about 5 years ago. The CDC had a panel, and they were trying to come up with what disorders had enough of an incidence rate and that could be treated, and what should be recommended. So I'll find it here, really. The problem really was technology had jumped ahead of the bureaucracy of, not the bureaucracy, but sort of, and not the knowledge, but tandem mass spectrometry came into, I really don't know what year, but all of a sudden they had these machines that could test up to 40 disorders with that one blood spot or 2 blood spots at birth. So it was still state by state, and I'm sure a lot of the parents and grandparents know that became one of the things. And I interviewed several parents, and at the time, the guy who was leading at the CDC, his quote was, in 2003, "Chaos is the state of newborn screening right now," says Harry Hannon, head of the newborn screening branch of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. And there was a young family that lived right outside Atlanta, and their son wasn't screened before he left the hospital. There was also the problem of discharging women out of the hospital right after they gave birth. My mom, I think, was in the hospital for 10 days when she had me. So some of these kids were not getting the test, and they didn't go to their doctor. And this is what happened to this young couple, and their son, Tyler Mize, died at 9 days old, and from complications from galactosemia. So when they learned, there were several things that went wrong in the whole process. But they formed this group, Save Babies Through Screening. And that got a lot of the attention of how do we make this more fair from state to state. It then went to, this is a close-up of the machines, and I live in Seattle now. This is a close-up of their newborn screening in Washington. You know, I can't really tell you, I can tell you how it works, but it would take a long time. Now, before I go on to another personal thing of what happened with disorders in the family, 2 years ago, people started sending my mother articles about how Jim Kelly, the former quarterback of the Buffalo Bills, had managed to get the attention of Congress, and Hillary Clinton at the time, who was a senator, to try and get more uniform newborn screening throughout the country. And the reason was his son died at age 8 of a rare genetic disease that they didn't know about. And Jim Kelly was a big deal in Buffalo as a quarterback. And of course, my father's also from Buffalo, and people started putting together. So Jim Kelly was a part of that, God, my notes are bad. That was happening in D.C., and at the time, of course, in state by state, a lot of parent groups were forming to try and fight not only for more screening, but also for legislation to pay for the drugs, to pay for the diet, to get a better tasting drugs. And this is a photo of my brother, who's just 2 years older than I am, and this is his daughter. And this is the first and last Christmas his daughter ever spent with her grandfather, my dad. And she was doing well. That's Julia is her name. And then at about age 14, she started having a lot of seizures, and they became more and more frequent. And they became very disabling to her. And they became those drop seizures where she just falls. And they had to start putting her in a helmet and then a wheelchair in high school. And my brother, Jim, he's a business professor, but he really does a great job researching. He really worked with a lot of doctors, and she's gone through 20 drugs combinations to try and get one that will help her disorder. Well, they went and screened a lot of metabolic disorders, again, through her, and then the idea was that maybe Kuvar would help. So the pharmaceutical company that makes that met with their doctor, and she's tried that, but she still has to wean off other drugs. And the reason I'm saying I'm letting you know this is because, and Virginia Schuett knows this feeling also, is that when you have a disorder that you can't control, it's just this horrible feeling of powerlessness. And my brother and his wife are just going through hell, basically. And that happens to so many families with young children who have diseases that they can't do anything about. And I just want to, I know you've been told this, but you have a disorder that was picked up at birth, and you have a way to control it. And I just want to say, stay on that diet. I started meeting kids when I was age 30 that were now age 20 years old, and they were in university, and they had gone off the diet, and then they started to get a little foggy, and then they went back on the diet, and they said, yeah, it really does work. You need to stay on that diet. My cousin, Margaret Dahl, was put back on a low phenylalanine diet, and she was really having a lot of problems, and it even helped her, and she's calmed down a lot, and her behavior is much better. This is my brother John, and he loved trains, and so he lived in a group home the last 15 years of his life, and he died 15 years ago of a sudden heart attack. A couple months later, my dad was then honored in Buffalo, New York, by a group that did a lot for advocacy for the disabled. And they came up with the theme of 30,000 thank yous because they had figured out that by that time, 30,000 children throughout the world had probably been picked up with PKU, diagnosed, and were now spared. My dad was not doing well by this time. He had congestive heart failure, he had Parkinson's, and it was really sad to see him so defeated. But he rose to the occasion, and the legacy, basically, of him and what he's done are all these people that are here tonight, and all of those that are doing amazing things in universities. A lot of these adults have an interest in being going into genetics. This is the Robert Guthrie Scholarship Fund that was started after my father died. And right now we're going through all these applications to try and winnow it down to people that get funding to go to college. And they're just amazing people. And so I wanted to say thank you on behalf of my family for continuing to recognize my father, asking me to be here at your inaugural conference. And I just wanted to leave you with a quote from my dad, who was known for some interesting quotes. And it was from an article that's called, from the Buffalo Evening News, November 1st, 1958. The reporter mistakenly said I was 2 weeks old. I was 2 months old at the time. Okay. But the article is called "Why Was Johnny Born Different? A Courageous Doctor Seeks a Cure." And it's sort of explaining what he's doing. And Dad is calling the disorder, claiming that all mental retardation is caused by what he calls a monkey wrench in the inherited chemical machinery. Some cases can be traced to injuries before or after birth, others to infectious diseases. But scientists know that some brain abnormalities are definitely due to chemical defects. One of those is PKU, or phenylketonuria. But the question really is, what is normal? Dr. Guthrie, who is something of a philosopher, points out, quote, "Now and then, nature produces an Albert Einstein. Since such intellectual capacity is possible, it may represent what we should consider, quote, normal, unquote. Perhaps the rest of us who fail to come up to that level are all mentally retarded in varying degrees." Okay, that's my dad. Thanks very much.
Thank you very, very much, Patty, for being with us tonight and sharing your father's legacy. And as you can see, he has now helped hundreds and thousands of kids, and many of them here in this audience tonight. And it's really, newborn screening and being able to detect PKU is really, I think, the greatest miracle of our public health system here in the United States. And we wanted to start this conference with a look back and a real honor of that legacy that Dr. Guthrie started and those before him that have really propelled us to where we are today, I think, on some really exciting horizons in terms of PKU research, treatment options, and an eventual cure. So thank you again very, very much for being with us.